Good morning. I'm Raleigh Flynn, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and welcome to our program this morning. We're talking about a very important topic, the relationship between Russia and Turkey. And I think this is a perfect example of how FPRI differs from the rest of the media. It's an incredibly important topic, and it's really not very well covered. Our moderator this morning is going to be our very own Anna Stein, who is our director of research and the director of our Middle East program. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you all to put your questions. We'll be taking questions starting about halfway through in the Q&A box. We'll also be putting some maps in the chat window as always, and we'll be recording this so that if you would like to watch it again or share it with your friends, there will be a recording on our FPRI YouTube site. Finally, I'd like to just once again thank our supporters and our members for their generous donations to FPRI. As I'm fond of saying, this is free to you, but not free to us, and we do appreciate the help you give us. And those who aren't yet members, I'd encourage you to become members. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Aaron now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Raleigh, and thanks everybody for tuning in. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and for in the case of Bob, the evening. I want to introduce our two panelists. First, we have Robert Hamilton, who is an associate professor of Eurasian studies at the U.S. Army War College and a Black Sea Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And we have Anna Mikulska, who is a senior fellow also at FPRI and a non-resident fellow in energy studies at the Baker Institute. And today they are going to talk about their recent report, which you can find in the chat box, or if not, you can definitely find it on our website, Cooperation, Competition, and Compartmentalization, Russian-Turkish Relations and Their Implications for the West. As I understand it, we're going to break it down into two segments. Bob will go first, followed by Anna, and then we will have a little bit of moderated discussion. I want to encourage everybody to make ample use of the Q&A box at the bottom. Type your questions in there, and if you have trouble working with that, you can type them directly into the chat. I will collect them, and I will pose them to the two panelists as need be. So with that, I think we agreed that Bob, you will go first, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aaron. So first of all, as a serving government employee, I need to do the standard disclaimer and say that anything I say here and anything that appears in the report, the opinions are my own and don't reflect the policy or position of the U.S. Embassy in Tbilisi, Georgia, where I currently work, the United States Army War College, where I normally work, or the Department of Defense. So Anna and I, the way we broke the report up is sort of, we used a framework of diplomatic, informational, military, and economic interaction. And we're looking at how Russia and Turkey interact using each of those instruments of statecraft. People in the U.S. government policy community will recognize those as what we call the DIME, D-I-M-E. So I took the diplomatic or political and the military interaction. And so I'll cover those first, and then we'll turn it over to Anna to focus on economic and a little bit of informational. We actually found that there weren't as many frameworks and there wasn't as much information available on informational interaction as the other three instruments. So to start, I would say we should care about Russian-Turkish relations for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're very high stakes in terms of geopolitical and security implications. This is NATO's original adversary, was the former Soviet Union. Russia is the successor, largest successor state to the Soviet Union. And one of its oldest members, Turkey, who has the second largest military in the alliance, right? So interaction between these two countries should matter and does matter, I think, to both policymakers and scholars in the West. And it has a huge impact. How they interact will have a huge impact on sort of the geopolitical zone that goes all the way from the Baltic to the Mediterranean and from the Central Asian states to Central Europe. The other reason we should care is that it's very dynamic. Right? The interaction between these two countries moves back and forth rapidly between cooperation and competition, but they've been able to compartmentalize their interaction in a lot of ways and cooperate in some areas while competing in others. So having sort of set the stage for why we should be interested in how these two countries interact, I'll now move into the diplomatic or political interaction. And one way to look at this is in what political scientists call the first, second, or third image, or the personal interaction between the two leaders, the interaction at the level of the two governments or the two regimes, and then the level or the interaction at the level of the international system. So when they meet each other out in the world, how do they interact? And I think at the first level, the interaction between the two presidents, there's a high level of cooperation, there's a high level of personal trust. These are two authoritarian populists who believe that the West is using liberal democracy to undermine or subvert their hold on power. And so they very much seem to have grown to have a mutual trust and a mutual respect for each other. So at that level, I think there's a high level of cooperation, convergence, and even trust. At the second level, how the two governments, the two regimes interact, they're both what I think we would call competitive authoritarian regimes. So in other words, there is political competition, it's real, but it's unfair. Both of them have the institutional trappings of democracy, but they don't function as liberal Western democracies function. So they both are regimes with strong authoritarian streaks and have a very, very tight focus on their own security and their own sovereignty, both of which they see as under threat by the West. And so at the level of the two governments, the two regimes, they seem to have, they perceive a common threat from the West. At the third level, the level of interaction sort of out in the world when they encounter each other geopolitically and politically, diplomatically in the world, we see more room for competition here. Both have historical mythologies that emphasize their own great power status. Both throughout history have been adversaries more often than partners. Both are pursuing what they call a Eurasian path or a Eurasian geopolitical policy, but each sees itself as the center of Eurasia. And so those two Eurasian paths may not necessarily be convergent. They could lead them to some sort of geopolitical or political competition. So that's how we saw the political or diplomatic interaction. In terms of their military interaction, here's where we think things could go wrong with little warning. They are present in a number of different conflicts in the region around the two countries, often on different sides of the conflicts. And people in the military say a lot, contingency happens on the ground. In other words, in fact, the US and Russia just had another sort of interaction in northeastern Syria this week. So things can happen between military forces that are deployed that the two capitals can't necessarily control or de-escalate quickly enough. So as Anna and I looked, we really thought that the military interaction between Russia and Turkey is where things could go wrong with little warning. And there have been a couple of cases in the past year and a half where they almost did. Syria is the most obvious case, the case of Idlib, which is a province in northeastern Syria, where Russia and Turkey have long been backing different sides. So Idlib is still not resolved. There was a Turkish soldier killed and around a dozen more wounded, some severely, this week in Idlib. And of course, there was a major escalation in that part of Syria from about January through March of last year that came very close to direct Russian-Turkish military clashes. So Syria bears watching. The South Caucasus bears watching. They differ politically and diplomatically over the fate of Georgia. Russia occupies two regions of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, that comprise about 20% of Georgia's territory. Turkey, on the other hand, is a strong backer of Georgia's membership in NATO, and it is a significant contributor of security assistance to Georgia. So Georgia is one place where they could, I don't see a military clash there happening, but they certainly have different security interests. Another is, of course, here in the South Caucasus, another region is Nagorno-Karabakh, the disputed region disputed between Armenia and Azerbaijan. There was, of course, an escalation there last fall that turned into an outright war that the Azerbaijanis won fairly convincingly, were able to take back almost all of the Azerbaijani territory outside of Nagorno-Karabakh that they lost to the Armenians in the original war in the early 90s. Russia has relationships with both sides, but has historically backed Armenia. In this conflict, this newest iteration of the conflict last fall, Turkey very overtly backed Azerbaijan and provided a lot of the equipment to Azerbaijan that was decisive in their victory in that war. There's now a peacekeeping contingent there that is comprised of about 2,000 Russian troops. Turkey has at various times said that they will participate with troops on the ground in the peacekeeping contingent. The Russians have said that there will be no other participation other than Russia. Turkey right now has observers in the peacekeeping operations center, the implementation center. But again, Nagorno-Karabakh and the fact that that was an escalation that Russia really, my sense is Russia did not need it last fall. It had positioned itself as really the sole arbiter of that conflict and had developed relationships with both sides. And Turkey sort of waded in and really destroyed that whole arrangement that Russia had by its overt backing of Azerbaijan, which enabled an Azeri military victory. And then you have in the military interaction what I would call the problem of proxies, right? Both of these countries use proxies, especially in Syria, but also they did in the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. The problem with proxies is they tend to be more risk tolerant than I think often their sponsors would like them to be. Some of the proxies backed by both sides have sort of religious apocalyptic visions, which could lead them to be could draw their sponsors into a conflict that neither side wants. So that's where we see the military interaction heading. So it's sort of a different story. The political interaction seems to be fairly stable. It's especially stable at the level of the two presidents and at the level of the two regimes. A little bit of room for competition out in the world when they encounter each other geopolitically and politically, but probably able to be managed. And of course, the recent case of Turkey and Ukraine as Russia increased its military posture around Ukraine's borders. Turkey was very vocal in its sort of support for Ukraine, but both sides seem to have managed that geopolitical or that political difference of opinion, I guess, effectively, and have de-escalated that. So, but in the military sphere, again, since both of them have forces and both of them have proxies in various conflicts, and contingency does happen on the ground, right? Things happen on the ground that often governments are unable to control. That's the area where we see the most potential for unwanted escalation and for moving rapidly from cooperation into competition or even conflict between the two. So I'll stop there. I'll turn it over to Anna and let her talk about her parts of the report.
Thank you, Bob. So in contrast to the military interaction, economic interaction has been actually based more often on collaboration than conflict. It has been actually one of the steadiest elements of that relationship. Very pragmatic, contractual approach where the countries were able to compartmentalize between the issues that might have in other areas of the relationship and their economic needs. And because they are neighbors, because they both large economies, they actually have they actually have been in the top 20 world economies in 2019. Russia is obviously a larger economy. Turkey performs better on the per capita basis, but in terms of purchasing power, they're actually quite similar. So a lot of similarities here. Also, their economic trajectories are similar. So they have been growing similarly in terms of last decade or two. It could, such growth between neighbors could mean both things. It could mean competition or collaboration. In the case of Turkey and Russia, it is more than anything collaboration. They have a complementary endowment, meaning that there is lots of things. I mean, there's Turkey's needs are where Russian exports are, and vice versa. And here, though, there is where there's asymmetry, quite significant. So Russian exports to Turkey are approximately are approximately 10% of Turkish trade, whereas Turkish exports to Russia are approximately 5% of the value of Russian trade. Obviously, the values are also quite extensively away from each other, so there's quite a lot of asymmetry here. And especially previously, this asymmetry has been also magnified by what the countries export to each other or import from the other. So for Russia, the exports to Turkey are mostly energy-based, mineral-based, so oil, gas, natural gas, right? Aluminium, steel. So not easily replaceable in general. In particularly here, and I will talk about the energy markets later on, since this is something that I really kind of focus on, but natural gas has been one big kind of item where it has been significantly much more difficult to replace by other suppliers versus what Turkey exports to Russia, like fruits, nuts, machinery, vehicles, and so on. So this could be much easier replaced by Russia, given the type of imports, but also the many suppliers and the many countries with which Russia actually trades. So one thing that has compensated this asymmetry over the years, which some do not really focus as much on and kind of don't really include in that relation, is actually trading services. And this is where Turkey actually has the leg up. That's where Turkey, and that comes to, that actually is specifically tourism, which, as we talk later, I can specify later, it actually has been used by Russia to kind of try to exert influence on Turkey, but also Turkish construction companies that actually work quite extensively in Russia. So this somewhat decreases the spread in terms of trade, actually by about $4 billion in 2018. So not a small change. So, however, this big asymmetry and kind of imbalance has recently changed somewhat, and this especially with regards to energy imports by Turkey. Changes in the global market, particularly, that have transformed the relation when Russia had been the dominant supplier, where it was extremely difficult for Turkey to replace Russian gas with anything else. Now, gas at this moment, natural gas at this moment, with impact of liquefaction and an expansion of trade in liquefied natural gas, has not become as irreplaceable as it used to be, particularly because Turkey has really pushed to diversify its energy supply. So this includes LNG terminals. Some of them, Turkey actually possesses some of the highest working in terms of capacity LNG terminals currently. New pipelines also from Russia, like Blue Stream and Turkish Stream, but also from other countries like Azerbaijan. And this is where Bob was talking about kind of working with other countries in the region. Azerbaijan has been one of those. And those economic ties Turkey is really trying to exploit. So that kind of one-sided relationship has changed a little bit, especially that because of these developments in trade in gas, Russia's power also in other regions has decreased. So other regions like Central Eastern Europe, Southeast Europe have now looked at other points of supply than Russia, and Turkey has become actually one of the most important transit territories for Russia. So that's where we see kind of this rebalancing of that relationship that has been highly skewed in terms of trade towards Russia, but now particularly in the energy sector has been changing. So yeah, and we see that also that Russia has used trade relations to punish Turkey for not walking the Russian line often. It has happened before, and Bob will probably go back to it when Turkey has shot down the Russian plane, and that the Turkish-Russian relations have completely kind of dissipated, and from general collaboration kind of really were pushed into distinct conflict. What we have seen, Russia has cut the travel, so tourism has evicted the Turkish companies, the construction companies from Russia. What Russia hasn't touched was gas. We see this constant kind of flow of gas through Turkish territory and to Turkish territory, which indicates that this is something that's going to persist because Russia has an interest of being viewed as actually a reliable supplier, right, with Turkey as a transit territory. And we can talk about issue that Russia has had with Ukraine on that, and that's what it's kind of tries not to have again with Turkey, and also the fact that Turkey and Europe, where the rest of the gas is going, is one of the Russia's biggest area of demand for its gas. So I'll stop at that, and we can take questions or go back to issues that are most of interest to the audience, given the questions. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you both for those introductory remarks. We have 3 questions in the chat right now. We want more questions because questions is always the more interactive and fun part about this. But we have, one that touches on both parts of your report. So I'm going to go in the order that we went in the order of speaking. And so first, I'll raise Matthew Kennedy's question, and this is for Bob. But and of course, if you want to jump in, you can. And I may add my own little tweak to it, as how are Russian-Turkish pursuits in Libya different than in Syria and the Caucasus? Maybe breaking down a little bit like how they compete on the military space, but how that doesn't necessarily mean that this is a net positive for Western interests, because some of the things that you hear is that Turkey is the only Western country, or at least member of the Western alliance, that is pushing back against Russia in some of these contested spaces like Libya or Nagorno-Karabakh. So maybe you can go into that a little bit dynamic that Matthew brings up, Bob. So the floor is yours. Sure.
So I would say, whereas in Libya, they very clearly backed different sides in the Libyan civil war. And both were in some form or fashion present militarily through proxies, or in Russia's case, at least the Russian Air Force was present. We know that. They deny it, but it's not a credible denial. The planes flew from Russia to Syria, were repainted, then flew to Libya. So they very much backed opposing sides. But they seem to have managed to keep that from escalating into a direct conflict between the two. Whereas in Syria, there are so many sides in the Syrian civil war that it's really hard to, you can't say that Russia and Turkey back different sides. I mean, they agree on some things, they disagree on some things, right? They disagree over the fate of Assad, where Russia wants Assad, or at least an Alawite Shia minority government, probably to continue to run Syria at the end when the war ends. And the Turks have been fairly clear that Assad should go, although they've backed that rhetoric off a little bit. They disagree mildly over the role of the Kurds. Turkey sees no role for the Kurds, and in fact, the main divergence between the U.S. and Turkey in Syria was over the U.S. support for the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a coalition of Kurdish and Sunni Arab militias from northern and eastern Syria. So they differ mildly over the Kurds. The Russians have been willing to reach out to the Kurds at times and have kept them at arm's length at other times. But they are each is on multiple sides of the Syrian civil war. What makes Syria, as I said earlier, so dangerous is the proxies, that each of them back proxies that don't necessarily have the interests that converge with their sponsors, and that are much more risk tolerant. So and then in the Caucasus, I guess the main difference in the Caucasus is that really only Russia is present militarily. And Russia is present militarily in all three South Caucasus countries, right? They're present in Georgia in their occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. They're present in Armenia. They have bases, legal bases in Armenia, as opposed to their bases in Georgia, which are illegal under international law. They have legal bases in Armenia, by agreement with the Armenian government. And now on Azerbaijani territory, they have 2,000 peacekeepers. So I would say that whereas in Libya, they clearly backed different sides in a war that was probably a little more of a two-sided war, in Syria, they each back sort of multiple actors in a war that has multiple sides. And so there's a very, very high, I still think there's a very high potential for unwanted escalation. And in the South Caucasus, really only Russia is present on the ground militarily. They back different sides nominally in the latest war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but Turkey was not, neither side was willing to intervene directly with their own military forces. Turkey intervened certainly with the provision of armed drones to the Azeris, and probably with the provision of operators to help them use those drones, which they did very effectively. There's very good evidence that Turkey sent some proxies from Syria to fight on behalf of Azerbaijan in the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, and there's even evidence that Pakistan and Turkey sort of collaborated to get some Pakistani fighters into the war on behalf of Nagorno-Karabakh. So really, three different sets of military interactions, with Libya sort of being the cleanest of the three.
Thank you, Bob. Anna, I think this one would be better directed towards you, and it's talking about BOTAŞ. And Turkish private importers have 8 BCM of pipeline gas contracts expiring at the end of 2021 with Gazprom. Do you see these contracts as getting renewed? And if yes, under what circumstances? I see you looking. Maybe, and then maybe something to go on and to tie this together is the broader question of the Turkish relationship with Ukraine and how it impacts the bilateral relationship with Russia. On the one hand, you see it closing security ties with the sale of the same armed drones that were provided to the Azeris and also used in Libya and in Syria. But on the other hand, the importance of things like TurkStream, which of course, poses problems for Ukraine as the transit point for gas. So just take it wherever you want to go, and Anna, the floor is yours. Then maybe Bob will come back to you.
Sure. So actually, the contracts expiring with Gazprom, I believe they might have already something set up. End of 2021 is too close for BOTAŞ not to have anything set up by Gazprom, and I haven't checked more recently. That being said, I'm quite sure that any type of contract that I think will be, if it's not yet in the works, will be signed, will be much more flexible than the contract would have been 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, which kind of reflects the change in Turkish position in terms of natural gas as a natural gas transit territory, demand center, but also what Turkey is trying to accomplish. It's not only trying to accomplish to kind of feed the gas to its own territory, but also potentially become a hub for distribution of natural gas to Southeast Europe in particular, or Europe in general. So that's something that Turkey has been looking at. That's why Turkey is it's putting quite a lot of focus on making sure that it diversifies its supplies. So we've seen the new pipelines, as I've mentioned before. Turkish Stream is one of those. Interesting part of it is that actually Russia is providing a discount for the gas that Turkey is getting via Turkish Stream for Turkey, as compared to other countries. So that's something that Russia does for Turkey. It used to do it for Ukraine as well, which questions its why would that be and what it kind of tries to accomplish. However, as I've mentioned, Turkey is much smarter in that kind of it makes sure that it has access to other resources, and that's very important. So if anything, you will see a shorter contract than it used to be, and that's actually across the board. We've seen that the contracts have been shortened, from 20-year contracts. We've seen now 10 is actually quite far. 2 3-year contract, 5-year contracts. We've seen this with Russia and Bulgaria actually. So and they're much more flexible in that there is actually the take or pay percentage has decreased. That means that it used to be in the 90%. Now it's at 75. It's usually the number, which means that a country can refuse 25% of its contracted volume of gas if it doesn't need it, or if it finds other cheaper gas. And countries have done this. In fact, beginning of the 2020, when you've seen this kind of flood of LNG into the markets, and Europe being one of the major points of destinations, with Asia kind of crippled by the early pandemic, you've seen actually a huge amount of LNG coming into Europe, including Turkey. I think it kind of used 44% of its capacity, which actually has been huge, because in regularly it brings in around, not capacity, 44% of its demand. So, and normally it uses around 30% of, it brings in 30% of its demand through LNG. So we've seen this changing. Now, in terms of Ukraine, it's an actually interesting relation, because when Russia has invaded Ukraine and took over Crimea, Turkey was one of the countries that have protested against that and has not accepted this, and kind of has issued a whole, condemnation of the act. However, it did not impose sanctions as, for example, EU has, or US and other countries have on Russia, which is an interesting and a decision given how much Turkey doesn't like other countries losing part of their territories due to some kind of separatist movement. So that's and also very recently, the Ukrainian President Zelensky has met with Erdogan when Russia has been kind of escalating its military actions at the Ukrainian eastern border. Ukraine has sold drones to Ukraine. Turkey has sold drones to Ukraine, so that has been also useful that was in 2019, and that those drones have been used there. So it's been quite difficult relation, and Russia has actually responded to what Ukraine has done recently, and it has basically closed the travel, including tourism, from Russia to Turkey, and that will cost Turkey quite a lot. So the formal reason for it was the pandemic. However, most people see a political reason into that ban on travel to Turkey, in that Turkey has been supporting Ukraine in its fight against the Russian aggression.
Bob, anything to add there?
No, I think, Anna, I think you covered all parts of that question very well, so I really don't have anything to add.
Well, let me just pick up on some, there's 2 other questions that I'm going to link together. Let me just pull it up here. Is that beyond this, is that there any potential role that Turkey could play diplomatically in trying to push ahead either some movement on Minsk or Minsk II in the Ukraine-Russia conflict? Could it be supportive in some other way? And 2, sort of stepping beyond that, right? We have, there is a contemplation on the Turkish side, and at least announcement, that there's going to be a construction of a canal. Erdogan himself calls it a crazy canal, crazy project, which would bypass the Bosphorus. And there have even been talks about building a second canal that would bypass the Dardanelles, which would bring into I guess, some legal question, that of the Montreux Treaty. And so what are the implications both for the Black Sea security here, and then the overt militarization, or the return of militarization in the Black Sea, linked to this Crimea issue, and link to sort of Russian military modernization, and focus again on the link between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So Bob, perhaps that's for you, and I can come back to you to talk about some of the economic stuff. So Bob, please.
Okay. Yeah, so on the first part of the question, does Turkey have a potential role to play as an arbiter in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? It's an interesting question that, to be honest, I hadn't considered, but I think, yes, it's possible, if only because Turkey is one of the few states that has functional relations with both. Let's dispense with the idea that Russia is an arbiter of the conflict and Russia is not a party to the Ukraine conflict, as the, because Russia is one of the Minsk process guarantors, but it's also a party to the conflict. So the two parties, the two state-based parties to the conflict are Russia and Ukraine. And then there are the unrecognized statelets of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. But the problem, I think, with the Minsk process as it's currently constructed is none of the participants with the Minsk process has a legitimacy or a functional relationship with both parties to the conflict, Russia and Ukraine. So Turkey is sort of in a unique position in that it does. And so I don't know whether the question envisioned Turkey joining the Minsk process or sort of launching its own process. I don't think I would be in favor of that, only because it sort of echoes the Astana process in the Syrian civil war that Russia launched really as a way to try to exclude the US and the UN from any sort of participation in the conclusion of the war and post-war Syria, outside of hoping for a whole lot of international donations to rebuild the country. But I do think, yeah, in the first part of the question, that Turkey does have a potential role to play. I don't know if there's a willingness on the part of Turkish diplomacy to wade into that conflict. So on the second part, yeah, sort of the Istanbul Canal, the Crazy Canal question is fascinating to me, because everything I've read indicates that at least the first part, the Bosphorus part, will be built. And there's already, contracts being let and dirt moving and things like that. If the second part is built too, and Turkey really does, what that would give Turkey is a sort of a rheostat, a way to dial up and dial down foreign military presence in the Black Sea. And what that means is leverage sort of over both Russia and NATO. NATO in the sense that if in the worst case, NATO, they would close the new canals to NATO ships, and NATO would be limited to the existing Montreux Convention limitations. But if Ankara really wanted to turn the heat up on Moscow, it could very easily, as a NATO ally in possession of, two canals that allow access to the Black Sea, it could very easily dial up the amount of NATO military presence in the Black Sea. So it's an interesting idea. It's one that I'm sure people in the Kremlin don't like. But I do think that Erdogan seems to be, and Aaron, more than any of us here about, probably how he operates and what's in his mind, but he seems to be very sort of dispassionate, calculating, and, sort of the type that has no permanent friends, only permanent interests type of leader. So this would seem to be a way for him to advance or defend what he sees as Turkey's interests against all sorts of different foreign actors.
Thanks, Bob. Anna, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Bob kind of touched upon most of the things. The thing that I think is important to realize with the kind of military balance in the Black Sea is that it used to be Turkey that was the one that was holding the most of the military power there. But with the Crimea being annexed by Russia, that has changed tremendously, with Russia adding additional new fleet to the Black Sea, and Turkey kind of calling then upon NATO to bring in more support, because Russia is making basically Russian Sea out of the Black Sea. So it's something that one needs to think about when talking about the potential build of new canals. Does it mean that this is a way in which Turkey wants to kind of reduce the Russian position in the Black Sea, the way it has grown in power after annexation of Crimea? I think that's quite important. And then, with Ukraine, I think it's kind of going to be continuing. Turkey is going to continue on the same kind of type of paradigm with supporting Ukraine, but really beyond selling potentially military equipment or military knowledge. I don't see any direct, support for Ukraine that would otherwise hurt Russia.
It's a very interesting dynamic, because I've asked some U.S. officials, would we actually care if they built a second canal? Because there could be a lot of benefits to get around Montreux, and I've never gotten an answer. So I'll report back if I ever do get an answer on that. But I can imagine that the Russians don't really want it. But here's another interesting question that I want to bring up, frankly, because I don't really know much about it. And it comes from our Deputy Director of Research, Maya Otarashvili, which is, what are both of yours take on the 6-country regional cooperation platform, which was proposed by Erdogan and the Turks, and is meant to include Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran, Georgia, and Armenia alongside Turkey? Is this a viable initiative, and what does it mean for the U.S.?
I guess I'll take a swing at that. I think so. It's dead on arrival in Georgia, I would say, because I don't see an appetite in Georgia to be part of a regional security platform that includes the country that's occupying 20% of Georgian territory. I know Turkey offered some sweeteners to Armenia, that if Armenia would join, then the prospect of Turkish-Armenian relations sort of, being reestablished, it would be on the table. Erdogan also said that Putin was positively disposed toward it. I'm a little skeptical there. I haven't read anything official out of Russia on it, but my sense is that Russia sees itself as the sole arbiter of the security situation in the South Caucasus. It is not interested in sharing that role with Turkey and Iran. Right, in this part of the world, in the South Caucasus, the old three-way for centuries, right? The old three-way geopolitical competition was the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, and the Russian Empire. So the Russians won that one in the late 18th century, and I don't think they're interested in any sort of. I'd be surprised if the Kremlin were interested in any sort of regional platform that sought to sort of include the 3 South Caucasus countries and then Russia, Turkey, and Iran as sort of equal external partners, because I think the Kremlin sees itself as the not necessarily a partner, certainly in the case of Georgia, but as the arbiter of the security situation and geopolitical situation here. And they don't need to share that role with anyone. That's my sense, my view. And I don't know, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think there is this interesting relation or interesting kind of nature of the Russia-Turkish relation, because while both of them have interests regionally to be the regional leader, Russia has also more interest than Turkey in being a global leader. So we will see actually Russia giving up some of what's happening in the region, not necessarily everything. And I think military or security area is where Russia is really sticking to it. But economic collaboration, it's kind of potentially giving away some of its influence to Turkey. And we've seen actually Turkey kind of moving inroads with engaging countries in the Caucasus and in Ukraine and so on in economic collaboration. And in a way, you could see that Russia is almost distracted sometimes with the global issues and kind of the bigger goal, while giving up some of its regional influence or potential, which Turkey kind of uses to its own advantage. And potentially Nagorno-Karabakh, that has been kind of what has happened there. Russia has been really, distracted by other things that have been happening at this moment, particularly with its relation with the U.S. So, and I think that's kind of goes to Maya's question: what does it mean for the U.S.? So, the more Russia engages regionally, the more it's going to be kind of involved in that. The more distracted it's going to be with the global relations, and I don't think this is going to be the case. I think Russia is still going to look more into its relation to the U.S., to the EU, but also to China. I think that's where really kind of it's it's not enough for Russia to be a regional power. It's been always to be the global power, one of the main kind of powers deciding the fate of the world. And when it wasn't able to do it based on its economic, situation and so on, we've seen growth of kind of the anti-democratic sense and growth of Putin to power based on this kind of notion that, well, we used to be the empire, now what? And I don't see it's changing going forward. So we will still, I think, see focus of Russia on the global issues, US, China, EU, with potentially giving up some to Turkey in the regional sense, but keeping really close eye on what's the most important, like security, still within the region.
So I want to ask a general question that I've been hearing a fair amount about, which, Bob, you brought up in your opening remarks. And it's something I agree with, is that there is a unique leader-to-leader relationship between Erdogan and Putin. They may not trust each other, but they have essentially, since the June 2016 Turkish apology for shooting down the Su-24, have created functional relationship in that when the two men agree on something, the bureaucracy is implemented. Something I'm hearing from my interviews with Turkish officials is that that basic dynamic may now be in tension, particularly over what some Turks feel as is sort of Russian backstabbing on the Idlib issue. Perhaps most poignantly being that a Russian Su-24, bombed and killed at least 34 Turks. But on the broader question of what this means for U.S. interests, U.S. and Western interests, is I still feel that there is a pervasive sense over here is that Turkish-Russian diplomatic actions are to the exclusion of the West, because both are interested in shoring up their own national interests along their own borders and do not feel that the West share, or at least is pursuing similar outcomes or goals. Given your recent report and your research on this, and obviously, Bob, you are in Georgia and have a unique sort of view on this because of the you're sort of one of those frontline states. Do you agree sort of with where this is going, and perhaps projecting forward, is this competitive? It's like, I guess, the competitive but slash cooperative relationship sustainable moving forward? Or will the Russians eventually wear out their welcome with the Turks, and we'll get to some place where it's just unsustainable? I'll stop there, and then I'll come to you after this as well. Okay.
That's a great question. It's a complicated question. It's a multifaceted question. So I would just say, you mentioned the June 2016 apology, followed almost immediately by the July 2016 coup attempt, which Turkey blamed largely on the West, especially the US, where Fethullah Gulen lives, and during which Putin was very quick to voice support for Erdogan. And so those two events, sort of, the apology and then the coup attempt, where, the West was ambivalent and even seen as at fault by Turkey, and the Russians were very clear and very quick to support Erdogan and set the relationship, I think, between the two of them on the path it's on currently. The question of, the Idlib backstabbing is interesting, because you could infer from my comments, I don't think Idlib's over. There's still, there's no solution that's available, I think, that would satisfy the interests of both sides. And it's still just a petri dish of different opposition groups that range from sort of what we used to call the moderate opposition to, the ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliated apocalyptic jihadist groups. And so, in some of the groups there are backed very explicitly by Turkey. Turkey fears the refugee problem that would ensue and started to ensue early last year when the Russians and the Assad regime launched their offensive. So my sense is, yes, I guess short answer, that yes, I think that the personal relationship between the two, and I do think there is a little bit of burgeoning trust, personal trust between the two, is fairly resilient. And I think their sort of, cooperation, competition, compartmentalization, the sort of pragmatic cooperation where they can, competition where they have to, but compartmentalizing the competition and not allowing it to spill over and affecting the cooperation. I think that's probably set to continue absent either a sudden change in regime in one of the two countries or both, right? In other words, one or both of the presidents leaving the scene suddenly, or a military escalation between them that happens so fast that the capitals aren't able to control it. And I think Idlib is the most obvious and most likely place for that to happen. But if those two things don't come to pass, if one of those two things don't come to pass, I think we sort of need to get used to this new normal where Russia and Turkey, at least in areas, cooperate to what we see as the detriment of Western interests. So that would be how I would answer that, and then I'd be interested to hear what you or Anna have to say.
And similar question. I just want to add one thing for you too, is that most people, particularly in the US, don't realize how many Russian tourists do go to Turkey, right? And I happen to be one of those that think that the Russian stoppage of charter flights was about COVID. I don't think it was about Ukraine, but perhaps I'm the fool. If we have a summer with no Russian tourists and a sort of not necessarily decoupling, but a lessening of economic interdependence on this one issue, on this one commodity, does this have effect on bilateral relations, or is it basically a COVID summer and Russians will be back in the fall?
Well, it's COVID gives if depending, we won't really know. It's probably a mix of the two. COVID has given a really nice cover up for. I mean, if you didn't have this, would Russia do something potentially? I mean, given how that Turkey is not doing well in terms of infection rate and so on. But we've seen this situation before. So in 2015, after the Russian fighter jet was shot down, actually Russia has already introduced sanctions on Turkey and cut the tourism to Turkey, which has brought quite a lot of distress to the Turkish tourism industry. And in fact, the tourism hasn't recovered. Despite the fact that obviously those sanctions has been taken off in 2016, the tourism rates haven't recovered all the way to 2019 when the pandemic hit. So we've seen that this is something that Russia is willing to use to encourage outcomes or policy outcomes that it would like to happen in Turkey, or to punish Turkey for whatever it does that it's not along the Russian policy and not the Russian benefit. So we've seen that this has happened, and it is going to be problematic. It's convenient in a way that COVID really kind of, it's hard to disentangle this, like what causes what, and whether there would be or there wouldn't be tourism and so on. We really cannot say. For now, I think that both of the countries, or at least Turkey, is trying to organize a summit in Antalya to show Russia that there has been measures that have been taken in Turkey to make any type of tourist this tourist destination particularly safe. So we probably will see whether this will open June 1st or not.
Yeah, I mean, the collapse of the tourism industry is often overlooked as a real driver of economic malaise in Turkey. But with that, we have about 5 minutes left. I want to ask one final question, and it goes to both of you, and perhaps this will also be the way to wrap it up. I often find Turkish diplomacy quite refreshing because they identify interests and they pursue those interests, even if those interests aren't necessarily what the United States wants of Turkey, right? So looking forward, both on the sort of political, military, and then on the economic and diplomatic interactions, what positive outcomes would we want from this bilateral relationship from a U.S. perspective to enhance U.S. or Western interests? And with that, I'll turn it over to you, and then I will close out the session. So, Anna, you want to go first on this one? I'll come back to Bob.
So you mean what positive outcome we could see from collaboration between Turkey and Russia?
What does the United States want from this bilateral relationship? Do we want it to crash and burn in the flames like the Su-24, or do we want it to prosper and try and make it be a little bit, there would be ways that we could spin it and be more positive to enhance US or Western interests, perhaps building on the Ukraine mediation question.
Yeah, I don't think it's in the interest, and I think we've made it quite clear in our report that it's not in the interest of the U.S. or anybody to create a conflict between those countries. It is not something that you want, particularly at the time that nowadays of the COVID and kind of growing, kind of really problematic economies, and what we're gonna do going ahead. Also, you know, Turkey could be a very useful player as a NATO member in engaging Russia, not on a conflict level, but on a collaboration level, right? It's somebody as a country that can kind of connect and talk, through which NATO or the US can talk with Russia without particularly engaging itself directly when such direct interaction is difficult. So that could be definitely helpful. One thing that I think it needs to be underscored, and it needs to, maybe we haven't done it enough, is that oftentimes collaboration between Russia and Turkey is not based on their own benefits. It's based on the relation that they have with other powers. And it's been usually where Russia and Turkey at the same time have been one way or another rejected by the great powers of the day, that they band together to do things together, to collaborate, particularly in a way that is detrimental to others. So like West and so on, basically working at cross purposes with what NATO would do and so on. So I think that's also important to think about, kind of not to alienate both of those countries, but engage and make sure that the substantive dialogue is happening. And I think that's definitely creating a conflict between them would not help, and it would just lose one way in which we could communicate across the spectrum of NATO member, supporter, and potentially an opponent or somebody who would conflict with NATO. Bob?
Yeah, so and I completely agree with you that Western interests are not served by trying to divide the two or cause the relationship to crash and burn like the Russian jet on the Turkish border. In fact, that's the last thing the West needs, is a NATO member and NATO's oldest adversary on the brink of war with each other. That's absolutely the last thing we need. So and I think we should focus on, okay, let's define, as Aaron, as you say, Turkey is good at doing, let's clearly define what our interests are and then try to advance or protect those. And my sense is our interests here lie in this particular bilateral relationship between Russia and Turkey. Our interests lie, we should focus on Turkey. Turkey's a NATO ally. Turkey's the second largest military in NATO. It sits at a geopolitical crossroads. Yes, it's a difficult ally for us. By the way, I think we're probably a difficult ally for the Turks at times too, but the relationship has been fraught. But it is a long relationship. It is a NATO ally to which we have, security commitment and guarantees on both sides through the alliance. And so we ought to look to ways to pragmatically resolve really the two biggest problems between the U.S. and Turkey now, which are the F-35 S-400 issue and the Syria issue. And so we should work through sort of pragmatic, nuanced policy that probably will require patience and compromise on our part to resolve those two issues and to try to set the U.S.-Turkey relationship back on a little more stable footing. If I could just say, my cynicism about Russia's use of economic sanctions for geopolitical purposes knows almost no bounds. When you live here in Georgia, or for instance in Moldova, you'll find that the quality of Georgian fruit, vegetables, wine, and mineral water is directly correlated to the state of Russian-Georgian relations. When they spiral downward, suddenly Georgian exports become very, very unclean, unhealthy, and dangerous, and they fail all the Russian import tests, and then relationship gets back on a more normal footing, and suddenly Georgian wine, mineral water, fruits, and vegetables are clean and healthy and able to be imported. So the Russians just very, very overtly use that as a geopolitical tool, the use of economic sanctions. So the Turkish tourism ban, maybe it's COVID, but Russia's history would lead me to be suspicious of that. I'll end there.
Well, maybe then don't drink Georgian wine, but drink Turkish, which is quite good. With that, I want to thank everybody for joining and logging in. Thank you for writing the report. Please check it out. It's on FPRI's website, where if you are so inclined, you can get further involved with FPRI, either by engaging with our analyses, our articles, our podcasts. And if you want even more, you can become a member, which is on the far right of that top bar, where you can click donate or membership. So with that, I want to say thank you again and have a good rest of the day.